Welcome to the Chicago Home Partner Real Estate Roundup. I'm Amanda McMillan. For those of you that are not familiar with who I am, I'm the CEO and founder of Chicago Home Partner. Over the past 2 decades, I've had this distinct pleasure of wearing a lot of different hats within the organization. One of my favorites always remains as the chief advisor. Those that know me best will tell you that I'm incredibly data-driven and very consultative, which is why I take such pleasure and enjoyment in being able to present this roundup to you. Now, the roundup is something that we've been doing for decades. That being said, you are enjoying the privilege, hopefully the privilege, of watching the first ever video roundup. Whether or not there'll be a second video roundup will be if you guys enjoy the first. Anyways, what is a real estate roundup? A real estate roundup, at least in our opinion, is a time that we dig deep and we take a look at what's happened over the last 12 months in real estate. In addition to that, we're going to take a look at all the predictions that we made from the previous year and see how we did. Seems like a little bit of a dicey thing with regards to how 2020 went. And then towards the end, what we'll do is we'll wrap up and we'll take a look towards 21 and what are we not only projecting to happen, but what are we going to put out there as our predictions? Now, let me put a little bit of housekeeping out there first and foremost. I'm going to be committing a few cardinal sins. Real estate is very specific and very local. That being said, I can't sit here and do a roundup to you and keep that in mind. So I'm going to be committing the ultimate sin, cardinal sin of real estate, and I'm going to be talking very high level, very surface level, and not very specific to different types of properties in specific locations. So I'm admitting the cardinal sin right off the bat, so you can't call me out on it. In addition, another thing important to note, the majority of our clients, not all of them, but the majority of the clients that we work with on a given year tend to live in the residential neighborhoods of Chicago, i.e. not as much downtown. Yes, we have a lot of clients that are downtown as well, but it is not the majority of the work that we do. So as we talk throughout this roundup, we are not going to be focusing on the downtown neighborhoods. If you have specific questions about a downtown neighborhood or any neighborhood or type of property in general, please reach out to me. Please reach out to your Chicago Home Partner representative to ask for specific information. So you have been warned. This is a surface level conversation on residential real estate in the Chicago neighborhoods. Okay, so let's get started a little bit. First and foremost, I always apologize when I talk about the market. To me, it's something that I'm incredibly passionate about, something that excites me, but I also recognize it's not the most riveting of conversations. So I apologize in advance. Hopefully you are choosing to be here and listening to me, so it's your choice, so hopefully you have some interest in it as well. As I always say, real estate on its most basic level is a supply-demand relationship. It's about how many homes are on the market and how many people are ready, willing, and able to buy those homes. That's as basic as I can make it. Now, what makes it complex, convoluted, muddy waters? There are thousands of things that impact each of those categories, the supply and demand, on a regular basis. As advisors, we're continually studying the impacts of those two so that we can not only understand what's happening in the market today, but we can help our clients to understand what's going to be happening in the market. That's as basic as I can make it. Before I dive into 2020, I need to just give you a tad bit of information on 2019, just so that we understand where we were at when we took a step into 2020. Realistically, we were in a good place to take on a very traumatic year. What do I mean by that? 2019 was a year in the market that we were experiencing a natural market correction. I know that sounds a little scary, but it was not scary at all. It was planned, it was predicted, and it was expected. As I explained to most people, the Chicago real estate often resembles a toddler roller coaster. We are not like the coast that see the peaks and valleys. We have ebbs and flows, small hills and valleys, something of the sort. So that's what we have to think about. So in 2019, that was a year that we were experiencing a natural market correction, which essentially means we were balancing, we were flattening out. Something very planned, very calculated. In fact, if you really date back and track it, it started all the way back in 2016 and ended up in 2019. The only thing that I need you to understand about that is, as I just said, the market was at a very balanced point. So if there was ever a market that we could say we were in a good point to take on world pandemic and complete social and civil unrest, we were at it, and that was a good thing. So what the heck happened in 2020 then? Seems like a really loaded question, doesn't it? Let's start off with the beginning of the year. The year started off different than we expected. Now, this is the 4th presidential election that I've been an advisor for, and it's always fairly the same. It's contentious, right? Our market, what we have to understand about our markets in general is our markets are reactive, but not when consumers think that they're reactive. The things that cause people to pause and think and overthink, that's the impact on the market. So whether we're talking about a presidential election, the possible increase of taxes, interest rates doing anything monumental to that, it's not the action that actually causes an impact on the market. It's the pre-action. It's the worry. It's the thought process. So when people call me up and said, Amanda, what do you think is going to happen in the market once the election is decided? Well, not too much. Realistically, it's the months leading up to there. So as we look to 2020, knowing that we were coming in off a very flat market, what we expected was another flat market. We figured we'd still sell a decent amount of real estate. We're a major metropolitan area. We sell real estate regardless, but that values were going to be flat. Deals were going to be contentious. The closer we got to the election, the more likely it was for things to get quiet. And that's what we expected. So as we stepped into the year and we had a different experience right off the bat, it caught us by surprise. About 2 weeks into the market, mid-January, we experienced a market that was more elevated than we expected. It's what I termed while we were going through it, a fake seller's market. Why was it a fake seller's market? Because there was nothing happening in the world or the economy that should have caused us to be in a seller's market, with the one exception that our buyers showed up to buy real estate before the sellers did. They were essentially out early. As I said, they showed up to the dance before the sellers did, and because of it, we found ourselves in a seller's market. Now, there was one thing that happened, which almost makes me chuckle now. Interest rates dropped right around 4%, and buyers were excited to buy. Little did they know they were going to drop a lot more after that, but at the time, they were excited to buy, and because of this, we were undersupplied. And being undersupplied meant that homes were selling in a more competitive environment and tends to be for a little bit of a premium. At the time, I was trying to get every one of my sellers that had been somewhat talking about selling real estate in 2020 to try and get on the market quick. Take advantage of this time that we didn't expect to see, and there was really no reason that it was happening. That market lasted for about 6 weeks. Started mid-January and went up to about March 1st. And then March happened. And our worlds, let's agree, our worlds changed a lot. I'm just going to talk about the real estate here because there is way too much to go into other things. As advisors, we had to react quickly to try and figure out what was happening and how the heck do we advise our clients. So first and foremost, the first things we did immediately when we started to catch wind of COVID was we looked to the states that were ahead of us, New York and Washington State. Each of those states was a few weeks ahead of us with regards to what they were dealing with COVID. Now, it's very important to note, neither one of those states deemed real estate an essential business. In Chicago, we were deemed an essential business, which essentially meant that we worked throughout the stay-at-home order. So we knew the numbers weren't going to be quite the same, but we had to understand what was about to happen to us. Now, in those two states, when we took a look at all of the terms and the metrics that we study, They saw very drastic reductions between 80 to 90%. So we knew it was going to be huge. So the first things that we did was we took a look at all of our clients that didn't have specific timelines, that didn't have the pressure of needing to buy and sell immediately. And we advised that they step out of the market. Just take a step back. We had no idea what we were dealing with yet. We had no idea how to practice safely. So we asked those to just sit on the bench for a little bit while we figure things out. The next thing we did, we had to figure whether or not we were on the brink of a housing crisis, right? We had millions of Americans losing their job. They can't pay their mortgage. Renters can't pay their rent. If renters can't pay their rent, the landlords can't pay their mortgage. The writing was on the wall for us to have major issues and possibly tumble back into a housing crisis. Now, the good news, the silver lining, is we're not fresh out, but close enough out of a housing crisis that we learned some things while we were in there. Now, I could probably bore you for 3 days straight talking into this camera on why we were able to extinguish that fear very quickly. I'm not going to, I promise. But I will give you a little bit of surface level of what gave us that confidence. First and foremost, in my almost 20 years of doing this, the banks acted quickly and correctly. They learned the hard lesson during the housing crisis. Owning real estate is a failing business model for most banks. They don't want to own real estate. They don't want to foreclose on properties because it's not a winning endeavor. So they reacted quickly and said, we are going to keep people in their homes as long as we possibly can. And that is our priority. They came out with loan deferments. They came out with installment plans. They gave homeowners opportunities to stay in their homes even if they couldn't make their mortgage payments. And that was huge. Deferment plans up to 12 months. So that was good. That took a lot of the pressure off and that kept people in their houses. Secondarily, and one of the biggest differences between what was happening in March of 2020 and what was happening in 2009, Americans had a lot of equity in their homes. Let me say that again. Americans had a lot of equity in their homes. When this all started, 63% of Americans had at least 50% equity in their homes. That's a huge number. That's an astronomical number. As I always tell people, in the city of Chicago, with all of the fees of buying and selling, if a homeowner has somewhere between 12 to 15% equity in their home, they're not going to walk away from it. They're not going to give it back to the bank. They may call me up and they may say, Amanda, I can't afford my house anymore. Let's sell it. But they're not going to walk away from the money that they have. So we were able to take a huge breath and say, you know what? We do not see a huge housing crisis on our hands. We took a breath, and all of a sudden we had to start diverting our attention to say, okay, so what do we have on our hands? Now we were 4-6 weeks into our stay-at-home order, and we started to have what I call COVID data that was actually happening in real time in Chicago about what was going on out there. Now, in the beginning, we found that it was very, very price segregated. If I loosely put price ranges on there, first and foremost, the luxury market. The luxury market, it felt like somebody hit the pause button. Let's call it roughly $1 million plus. Once again, it depends where it is, what it is, everything of the sort. But the luxury market, it was like somebody hit a pause button and just let it sit. I had clients, I had sellers coming to me saying, hey, Amanda, it's been quiet. Do you think we should adjust the price? Do you think we should do something? And the answer was always no. Nobody's watching. Nobody's doing anything in that market. That market has gotten so still that just needs to take a breath, and we need to give it that opportunity to. The middle market, call it 500 to $1 million. That depended 100% on what it was. This is when we started to really see what I called COVID-friendly features start to become more important in properties. COVID-friendly features were things like smaller, more intimate buildings, single-family homes, townhouses, maybe something with a private entry, more space, more outdoor space, just the ability to live within your home better. So if something had a lot of COVID-friendly features and was in that middle price range, it probably did well. A nice single family home for under $1 million in a good location, that was doing well. Townhouses, duplex downs, anything that gave more space, more opportunity was doing well. If it was something that was smaller or a little bit more regular, maybe a newer construction, 2-bedroom, 2-bath, say 1,100 square feet in Lincoln Park, it probably wasn't doing as successful during that time. The under 500 market, that was like wildfire. Now, what you have to remember was all of this was happening during our busiest time of year, right? We kind of joke in Chicago and say the biggest move date of the year, the biggest lease end date of the year is May 31st. So if we're looking at March, April, May, this is our busiest season. There are so many people that use that time of year to get out of their leases and to buy their first home. So we saw a ton of pressure on this. We saw a ton of pressure on the people that said, hey, this was my year to buy a home. And by the way, now interest rates are 3%. I don't want to let something like COVID get in the way of that. So we had a market that was thriving, but we didn't have homes to sell them, right? Demand was up, supply was down. So if something came on the market under 500 in a good neighborhood and was a good property, especially if it had COVID-friendly features, it was typically very, very competitive and cutthroat. So that market, as I said, was kind of like wildfire, and it was just trying to keep up with it. We didn't nearly have enough homes to sell people. So as we moved through this, we started to get to the end of the stay-at-home order. As the order expired, our market really erupted in a very, very intense manner. You have to realize a couple things. We had pent-up demand. We had three plus months of our busiest time of year essentially coming to a head, and all these people that had deferred their housing needs that had planned to do stuff. Now, as we were coming out of the order, we observed something that was pretty interesting. We had learned a lot more about COVID at this point. And I think the more we learned, the more people started to feel comfortable with the fact that they could control their own actions. I can put myself in safe environments, I can protect myself, and I can feel like I'm okay. So with that, we saw that our buyers were much more willing to come back to our market under the pretense that I can put a mask on, I can go into a home, I can sanitize my hands, I can see the home, I can leave, I can sanitize again, and I can feel like I've put myself in a safe environment. Now, the problem with this was our sellers didn't necessarily feel the same way. Now, I am very proud to note that, I think we ended up selling 50 listings last year. And knock on wood, we had no issues with COVID. Our protocol was tight, we were consistent, and we were safe. But even with that being true, sellers were slower to come back to the market. Sellers were nervous about the idea, do I allow people into my home when we've got a deadly virus going on out there? And so a lot of sellers just said, I don't feel comfortable with it yet. And they didn't put their homes back on the market. So out of the stay-at-home order, our market erupts, and it erupts in a manner that, once again, we've created more demand than supply, which this caused our market, for the most part, to be very feverish, to be very cutthroat. Now, this was all happening in pretty much June. Important to note, July and August tend to be two of our slower months of the year. A lot of people are often surprised to hear that. As I always say, in Chicago, we long for summertime, and people don't want to spend it with their real estate advisor. I don't take it personally. But with this being true, these tend to be slower months. As we found ourselves towards the end of June at Mach speed, we tried to figure out whether or not we were just going to bulldoze through summer. Bulldoze through that market, kind of have this deferred spring market of all these people with housing needs, and to see how it goes. And for the start of the summer market, we absolutely saw that. We saw that in July, our market was up, I would say until about the middle of the month. And then it started to get a little quiet. Which personally, what I think, and I can probably support it with enough professional data, so it's not just personally what I think, people started to get a little distracted from the market in what I think is a very good way. We found that summertime gave us the ability to reenact a level of normalcy. We could do things and not just feel trapped in our homes. We could go for walks. We could go for a hike. We could go for a bike ride. We could go out to the, other places and not feel confined that we couldn't do anything. And with that, Chicagoans let themselves find their own normalcy and get distracted from real estate. The closer we got to Labor Day, the quieter it got, which once again, very, very normal. Now, the one thing that wasn't normal is that the last 2 weeks before Labor Day, and as I said, I've done this for almost 20 years, the last 2 weeks of Labor Day, which tend to be very much a quiet time in real estate, and it was in terms of everything but consultations. I can honestly go on record and say, in all my years of doing this, I had more real estate consultations in the 2 weeks leading up to that time than I think ever in my career. Now, what we have to understand is that we had duct taped our housing situations together for 6 months at this point. And now we were seeing higher level decisions being made. Chicago Public Schools decided they were going to start virtually. A lot of companies and corporations decided either they're not going to bring anybody back for at least a year, if they do at all. As these higher ups started to make decisions, it forced homeowners to start make decisions as well. Start to say, I've got 2 adults working from home now, and I've got 2 kids that are virtually learning in a house that we typically weren't in from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. So what we started to see is that people's housing needs were challenged. And with that, they were starting to try and figure out what to do next. So as I said, the two weeks leading up to Labor Day were some of the busiest of my career without doing showings or really selling real estate, just in terms of talking to people about what comes next and what we do next. And I wasn't alone in this. Most of the top real estate advisors that I speak with were all having these conversations as well. So the next question that we had to look at to say, what is going to happen next in this market? We have to remember that throughout all of this, we were in uncharted waters. So sure, I can rely on my years and years of experience, but I'm relying on years of experience of something that we have no idea what we're in. Now, typically, as we round the bend and we pass Labor Day and we get into our fall market on a presidential election year, it tends to get very quiet. So we were at this pass to say, which is going to take precedence? The presidential election or consumers' dire need to have new housing? Well, easy to project now because it happened. What we saw happen was we saw that much like all the previous elections I've been a part of, the presidential election plagued our third quarter and much of our fourth quarter. What we have to remember is that Chicago is a very blue city. And with that, the contentious nature of the election essentially brought us to a standstill. It was almost as if the city was holding its breath. And let's not forget the fact that not only were we dealing with the election, there was a lot of stuff going on as well. We had the death of Justice Ginsburg. We had the Louisville indictments. We felt like weekly we were getting hammered with something that was big and monumental. And I haven't even touched the surface on the social and civil unrest that was happening out there. Trust me, I'll get back to it. I promise I'm not going to forget that it happened. So what we saw in third quarter, we saw a little bit of what I call paralysis. Our market was paralyzed with everything going on, with fear, with contention, with question marks. It's what I talked about in the beginning of this. It was paralyzed by pause. The markets were feeling the impact of people overthinking what was about to happen. Now, typically, right after the election, we see a little bit of a pop in the market. But let's all remember, election day turned into election month. We did see a pop, but it actually happened in December, which is a very, very unusual time for us to see our market take a little pop. Because let's think about it. December tends to be a slower time of the year. But once the election was finally decided, we did still see that pop. That pop typically is a suggested confidence in our market. So we closed out the year with some confidence in our market. Now it's interesting. I'll dive a little bit more into the numbers, obviously, when I talk about the recaps. But so you have to think about it that we had this inflated market followed by a deflated market. I've had to say this several times, more than several, maybe several hundred times over the last year. And it's very much a hard thing for me to say. Real estate did better in 2020 because of COVID than if COVID didn't happen. That's very hard to talk about anything thriving because of something so traumatic. At least for me it is. But that's the general thing that we have to understand, is that we had not predicted it to be a particularly strong year. And I wouldn't necessarily say it was particularly strong at the end, but it was stronger because of that traumatic event and the traumatic events that we're going through with regards to that. Okay, so with all that being said, I skipped over two major components of the year that are very important for me to talk about. First and foremost, one of the questions that I got more times than not with regards to real estate within the city of Chicago was, is Chicago experiencing a mass exodus? Are we losing the love for our city and moving to the suburbs, moving out of state, moving somewhere else that's less condensed? That was a question that I got time and time and time again. The short answer is no. Chicago is not experiencing a mass exodus. What we did experience was this. We saw that Chicagoans had priorities change, right? I talked about it before, COVID-friendly features. So the things that we saw happen was that people decided that perhaps high-rise living wasn't as important to them, especially if they didn't have to prioritize a short commute to the office. So as I talked about before, in not talking about our downtown, we did see that we had a lot of people move out of the downtown because it didn't necessarily have the needs to accomplish what they were looking to accomplish with their housing. People didn't feel the need to pay a premium for space because of the location proximity to work. People weren't willing to pay high assessments for amenities, much of which were closed down for the year they didn't feel comfortable in. So we did see quite a few of our homeowners reprioritize some of their needs and move from our urban downtown to our urban neighborhoods. That was one of the trends that we tended to see. Another thing that we saw a lot of our people that absolutely loved living in the downtown of the city start to look to second homes, right? Our travel patterns were changing. We were no longer flying out of the country, out of the city. So what we found is a lot of our downtown residents and residents of Chicago said, I want a little getaway within a short commute to Chicago. Second home purchases within a short ride of the metropolitan city skyrocketed. Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, Iowa, all of these areas saw that homeowners were looking to get second homes, a place to get out of the city for a little bit. They could work remotely more, so having something that they could go to and maybe spend a little bit more time at became a priority. The group of people that we saw decide to pack up and leave the city and leave all parts of the city tended to be the people that had it in their plan anyways. We had people that had it in their plan to stay in the city for another 1 to 5 years. I would say a large group of this were young families that were okay to be in small quarters based on the fact that they were enjoying the lifestyle of what they loved about living in the city. But all of a sudden, if you took away all of the aspects that they really enjoyed about the city, cramping a family of 4 into a 1,400 square foot, 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo just didn't feel as appealing anymore. So a lot of those people that had it in their plans already to move out of the city, those people decided to expedite their plans. And they decided to maybe make that transition before they had really wanted to. But I wouldn't say that what we felt was a mass exodus from the city. If anything, I feel like Chicagoans really banded together throughout this and found even a stronger love for their city. So it was an interesting thing to see, but that is one of the questions I get quite a bit. The other question, the elephant in the room that I didn't talk at all about. Obviously, in 2020, we came to terms with the fact that we have had certain social and civil issues ingrained in our lives for centuries. And a lot of this was brought to the surface in 2020. And I am thrilled that as hard as it has been to watch and live and be a part of this, I'm thrilled that this has come to the surface. And it are things that are causing change. What did that do to our real estate markets? For the most part, the impacts that we saw really impacted the downtown market. As I talked about, I'm not going to talk too much about that. Our markets, our more neighborhood-based markets, had minimal impact because of all of the social and civil unrest that we've seen throughout the year, whether related to Black Lives Matter or related to the strong civil division in our country based on politics. But we didn't see too much impact based on those two sectors. I did want to just touch on that because obviously they're both very important topics for us. But our actual real estate markets, the impacts that they were was a little bit of hesitancy in certain markets, but in the big picture, we didn't see too much impact. So with all that in mind, let's grade ourselves, right? At the beginning of 2020, we put together projections on what we thought we thought the year was going to be like. Well, granted, nothing that we would have expected out of this year was right, but we still made projections and we're still going to grade ourselves on it. And believe it or not, there's some more similarity in the overall markets on our predictions than one would guess. Now, the reasons we got to those places were very, very different, and I'll try and kind of jump in and explain that. First and foremost, what did we expect to happen to prices of homes? We went on record and we said home prices will remain flat or slightly down throughout 2021. Right? That's what we expected. It was a contentious presidential election year. It was a fairly safe bet. Now, the term of metric with this is average sales price. What was the average sales price throughout the year? And then how do we rate that compared to the year before? What we saw year over year from 2019 to 2020 was a 1% increase in sales price. Maybe I'll give us a C on that. I usually say anything within 2% we're pretty close on because that's my just margin of error. But we saw a slight, a fairly flat market with a slight positive emphasis. That's what I would say, where we had projected a flat market with slight negative emphasis. Now, the interesting thing is if you go back to different times in our market, you would have a different result. As I told you, the first half of our market was quite bullish and undersupplied, so that we actually saw a little bit more growth in prices during that time of year. But the slow Q3 and Q4 balanced that out, and that's why we came back to a place that, once again, year over year, despite everything that we went through, pricing was relatively flat with a slight positive emphasis. We expected the housing inventory to improve. Now, this is an interesting one because I've sat here and I've talked to you about the fact that we were undersupplied for the last 20 minutes. We thought that houses were going to improve. The inventory was going to improve in 2020. We expected more homes for sale. Now, after I talked to you about this and all the depleted inventory and not enough homes to sell people, you would automatically think that we were totally incorrect in that prediction. In fact, we weren't. We were spot on. Once again, for totally different reasons. But the inventory increased year over year by 5%. Now, you're thinking, Amanda, how could it have increased by 5% if you just told me we're undersupplied? Well, the inventory increased by 5%, but the demand increased by more than that. So we were undersupplied in comparison to the amount of new demand that we had by changing housing needs. But year over year, we were still up. So we get a point for that one. The one that we totally screwed up, that I totally think that we couldn't have been right no matter what, mortgage rates. We figured mortgage rates would stay very similar throughout the year. That's a pretty safe bet in an election year. Nobody wants to buck the change. Nobody wants to make anybody upset about it. So we tend to see that they're consistent throughout the year. Now, once again, interest rates went down. Our year over year for 2019 was just under 4%. 3.94 was our average for 2019. Our average for 2020 was 3.11. never thought in my career I would talk about numbers like that. So that's an interesting piece that we were totally wrong on. That is 100% because of what was happening in with regards to a pandemic, social and civil unrest, an economy on the brink of collapsing that had a lot of things going on that was trying to spur on that market, spur on the housing sector, which it absolutely did. And actually, we look back at the economy and we look back on such pride with what the housing sector has been able to do during such a turbulent time for so many other industries. So that one, totally wrong on, and we're okay to be totally wrong on. Number of home sales, number of transactions, that's how we judge it. We said that the number of home sales year after over year will be flat or slightly down. Once again, we were spot on with this one. We saw that the number of home sales decreased in 2020 from 2019 by just under 3%. Now, once again, if we look at it, during certain times of the year, the market was up and we were selling a lot of homes. But for the most part, we were dealing with the fact that people weren't comfortable being on the market and we didn't have inventory. So because of that, our market was essentially strangled and didn't have those pieces. And that was the first half of the year. The second half of the year was just confidence in what was happening in our world. So overall, we saw that the number of transactions was down just under 3%, which is what we had predicted. We predicted it more based on just the presidential election alone, but the results were still the same. The last thing that we jumped in and put some thought process into had to do with regards to seller realism. And what this means is kind of what is our average days on market? Our time on market. This kind of tells us seller realism is how realistic sellers are when they hit the market. We had said that we thought seller realism was going to increase in this and essentially we judge that by seeing the days on market decrease. So if sellers are more realistic, the days on markets decrease. We actually saw a 5% decrease in the days on market in 2020. Once again, very different reasons that we got there, but our results were the same nonetheless. So kind of interesting to note that what we had positioned so much on, very strongly dependent on where the market was and with regards to the presidential election, with the exception of interest rates, we were pretty spot on, which is, as I said, very unusual to say because we got to every result by a much different path than what we had thought. But anyway, still always glad to report that even in extreme intense circumstances, we were still doing and advising correctly. Anyways, let's get to the final phase of our real estate roundup. If you've made it with me this far, thanks for sticking in. I'm hoping that you're getting some good stuff out of this. So I'm going to try and be fast and furious with this. I don't do anything fast and furious, but let's try this. Home prices. Home prices we think are going to go up. Not significantly, but we should see a slightly above flat market. I don't think it's going to be flat. I think we're going to see a little bit of growth with regards to our home prices. I think that's something that we feel fairly confident in. So not extravagant, but see a very modest growth in home prices overall. Interest rates. I don't think we're going to see a lot of movement in the interest rates right now. But as our economy starts to improve, as the vaccine continues to roll out, as confidence starts to grow, our interest rates, they have no choice, but they'll have to start going up. So I think that towards the end of the year, that we might see a little bit of the interest rates going up. But I think that there's been a pretty strong commitment for it to stay fairly low and fairly aggressive between now and then. So a possible slight increase in interest rates towards the end of the year. Inventory should remain on the slighter side throughout the year, but there are a couple different events that give us the opportunity for it to grow. And both that we think are absolutely going to see. So overall, we think inventory is going to go up. The two events that we're tracking first and foremost. Number one, the expiration of the loan forbearances. Now, the good news is a lot of people that put the loan deferments, the loan forbearances into place, about 50% of them within Chicago have already gotten themselves off of those payment programs or the lack of payment. So a good percentage of them have already taken themselves out of those programs. But we still have a good majority still in them. And with that being said, as we get closer to that year anniversary, Most of those programs were exercised in April and May. So as we get closer to those year anniversaries, we are going to have people that said, I'm still unfortunately in the same housing situation, in the same financial and employment situation that I was a year ago. I unfortunately haven't been able to find a job, and I can't afford my house. Now, as we talked about already, people have a lot of equity in their homes. So these aren't people that we're expecting to necessarily foreclose on their homes. These are people that we expect to come to us and say, Amanda, it isn't what I wanted to do, but I think it's time to sell the house. So when we start to get a little bit closer to that, I think on that year anniversary, we have the ability to see inventory move up a little bit more. The other thing that we're watching is just with regards to confidence of the vaccine rollout. We have a lot of home sellers that have deferred all of their plans due to COVID. We had people that were ready to go to market February, March 1st, 2020 that had said, nope, hold on to the photos, hold on to everything. We're living in our house until we feel comfortable. So as the vaccine rolls out, we have a lot of people that have essentially put their housing plans, their housing endeavors on hold. Those people are going to start coming to market too. So those are two things that I think can help us to see an increased market in inventory. So I think overall, we're going to stay undersupplied in a lot of our markets, but I think overall will be an increase. Home sales. I feel like this one's not really fair because naturally I think our home sales are going to be up as well. We're basing it off of a year that things were down and then a lot of people didn't feel comfortable coming to market. So as we grow this consumer confidence in all facets, home sales should bounce back up, right? They were down last year. We expect them to bounce back up. General, how are people feeling about the market? How is people confidence? This isn't really one of my predictions. This is just a little bit of where I think is good for us to hopefully tie this up because I'm sure you're tired of listening to me now. Overall, I think today people feel relatively confident. If you would have asked me 30 or 60 days ago, I probably would have told you something very different. But now we're at a point that we have a new administration and the city is feeling confident about that. We have a vaccine rollout that's going better than average. We're struggling to get our kids back in school, but we're hopeful that that's moving in the right direction. And we're all learning to find some level of normalcy. And all these things are breeding confidence within the people in the city. And that confidence is going to continue to grow, obviously pending any other world catastrophes, which I feel like I have to say now just to cover my you-know-what after what we've been through. Because every time I've said in 2020, what else could happen? Something else happened. But for the most part, I think consumer confidence is at a cautiously good point. And I think that's something that we're going to feel and we're going to see in our markets this year. So that is what I've got for you. If you stayed around for the whole time, gosh, thanks for being here. I'm hopeful that you picked up some good information. As always, if you have specific questions about your home, your housing needs, your situation, feel free to reach out to me or your Chicago Home Partner Advisor, and let's talk. On that note, be safe, be kind, be well.